She was given something most people will never have in their entire lives: a fortune, multi-million-dollar companies, luxury properties, investments spread across multiple industries, and a family name that opened doors wherever she went. She didn't have to build that empire. It was already waiting for her the day she was born. But there's a truth that very few people understand. Inheriting wealth and being capable of protecting it are two completely different things. Because building a fortune takes hard work. Keeping a fortune takes wisdom. And sometimes all it takes is one person to destroy what generations spent decades building. This is the story of an heiress who had everything she needed to become the guardian of an extraordinary legacy. But instead, she became the greatest threat that legacy would ever face. To understand how it all happened, we need to go back many years. Ever since she was a little girl, she heard the same words over and over again. One day, all of this will be yours. The phrase echoed through family gatherings, holiday dinners, conversations about the future. And over time, she came to believe that her destiny had already been written. Her family wasn't just wealthy. They were one of the most respected families in the region. Over several decades, her grandparents had built a true empire. They started with almost nothing. They struggled financially. They took risks that could have cost them everything. They spent years working without any guarantee of success. But they refused to quit, and eventually, they won. When her parents took over, the challenge was no longer building. It was expanding, and they did it masterfully. They acquired new companies, entered new markets, made strategic investments that multiplied the family's wealth. With each generation, the empire grew larger. But there was something even more valuable than the money. Their reputation. The family name stood for trust. Business partners wanted to work with them. Clients believed in their word. Employees were proud to be part of their companies. The legacy wasn't built on wealth alone, it was built on credibility. And from an early age, everyone believed she would be the one to carry that legacy forward. After all, she was the only heir, the next successor, the person destined to lead the empire into the future. From the outside, everything looked perfect. She attended the best schools, moved in elite circles, had access to opportunities most people could only dream about. Every sign suggested she was being prepared to take over one day, and for a long time, nobody questioned it. Nobody saw a reason to. Because whenever people looked at her, they saw the natural continuation of a success story. What they didn't see was what was happening beneath the surface. Quietly, almost invisibly. Certain traits were beginning to emerge, traits that seemed insignificant at the time. Small habits, small attitudes, small warning signs. The kind of things people dismiss because they don't seem important. But years later, those same warning signs would reveal something far more troubling, something capable of putting an entire legacy at risk. A legacy that generations had sacrificed their lives to build. And the most surprising part, the warning signs had already begun. People just weren't paying attention. But before we reveal the red flags that everyone ignored, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this remind us that small decisions can change the fate of entire families. And if you enjoy stories about success, power, failure, wealth, and life-changing lessons, make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss a future video. Now let's continue, because the first signs that something was wrong were already starting to appear. If there's one thing that almost every great downfall has in common, it's this: they rarely happen all at once. Before the collapse, there are usually warning signs. Small red flags, small behaviors, small decisions that seem insignificant in the moment, but later reveal their true meaning. And that's exactly what happened here. While her grandparents built the family fortune through sacrifice, discipline, and relentless hard work, she grew up in a completely different world. She never worried about paying bills, never had to take risks to survive, never had to hear the word no when she wanted something. From the very beginning, success wasn't something she chased. It was simply the environment she grew up in. But there was one important difference. She enjoyed the rewards of wealth without ever experiencing the struggle required to create it. At first, nobody saw that as a problem. After all, isn't that what every parent wants? to give their children a better life than they had themselves. That had been the entire purpose of the family's success, to create comfort, to create opportunity, to create a future free from the hardships that previous generations endured. But over time, certain behaviors began to stand out. Whenever she was invited to company meetings, she seemed uninterested. While executives discussed strategy, she looked distracted. While leadership teams reviewed numbers and growth plans, her attention was somewhere else. Sometimes she showed up simply because she felt obligated. Other times, she didn't show up at all. Her family tried to guide her. They explained the importance of understanding the business. They talked about responsibility. They shared lessons learned through decades of experience. But their advice rarely seemed to stick. There was always an excuse. Always a reason. Always a sense that these things could be learned later, as if there would always be more time, as if taking over the family empire was just a formality. But the people who truly understood business knew it didn't work that way. Leadership doesn't magically appear the day you're handed a title. It can't be inherited like a house or a bank account. It has to be developed, earned, practiced over years of experience, and that preparation seemed to be missing. Some of the company's senior executives noticed it. Employees who had spent decades with the organization noticed it too. Even close family friends quietly saw the warning signs, but almost nobody talked about it openly, because there was one uncomfortable reality standing in the way. She was the heir. The future leader, the person who would eventually control everything. Questioning her readiness felt almost unacceptable. Very few people were willing to raise concerns. Even fewer were willing to have the difficult conversations that needed to happen. So the warning signs were ignored, and the longer they were ignored, the more obvious they became. She showed little curiosity about the business, little interest in learning, little desire to understand the challenges facing the company. It was almost as if she believed success would always be there. As if it were permanent, as if something built over generations could never be lost. But history has proven something over and over again. Empires rarely collapse because of a single competitor or a single economic downturn. More often, they begin to fall apart when the people responsible for protecting them stop understanding the value of what they have. And without realizing it, the future heiress was moving in exactly that direction. She hadn't made any catastrophic mistakes yet. She hadn't made any disastrous decisions. Not yet. But something far more dangerous was already taking shape. She was developing complete confidence in something that had never truly been tested. Her own abilities, and when someone believes they're prepared before they've actually proven it, problems tend to follow. Sooner or later, at the time, however, nobody imagined how far this would go, because the real trouble hadn't started yet. The real trouble would begin the day she finally gained the power she believed was always meant to be hers. For years, that moment felt inevitable. Everyone knew it was coming, everyone expected it, and when it finally arrived, it was treated like a celebration. The succession was officially underway. The heiress was taking control of the empire her family had spent decades building. The ceremony was filled with emotional speeches, photos were taken, business partners sent congratulations, employees applauded. And many believed they were witnessing the beginning of a new era. After all, that family name carried a powerful legacy, a legacy built by people who had devoted their lives to turning dreams into reality. Now it was her turn to write the next chapter. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. In the beginning, the mood was optimistic. Investors were confident, clients remained loyal, employees hoped the new leadership would bring fresh ideas without abandoning the values that had made the company successful in the first place. But it didn't take long for things to start changing. Just a few months later, new warning signs began to appear. This time, however, they were much harder to ignore. With power finally in her hands, the heiress began making decisions that caught many people off guard. Fast decisions, impulsive decisions, decisions made without the careful analysis that had defined previous generations. For decades, every major move had been thoroughly examined. Risks were studied, consequences were evaluated, experts were consulted. Nothing important happened without serious discussion. Now many of those safeguards simply disappeared. Patience gave way to urgency, strategy gave way to impulse, and experience slowly began losing its seat at the table. Some of the company's most respected executives tried to advise her. These weren't ordinary employees. They were people who had helped build the organization, people who understood the market inside and out, people who had survived economic downturns, fierce competition, and difficult business cycles. But their advice was increasingly viewed as an obstacle. Their warnings were dismissed, their concerns were minimized, their experience was treated as resistance to change, and little by little, something dangerous began to happen. The most knowledgeable voices in the room stopped being heard. Instead, influence shifted toward people who always agreed with her, people who rarely challenged her ideas, people who told her exactly what she wanted to hear. At first, it looked like nothing more than a different leadership style, but before long, it became clear that it was something much more serious. Because when a leader stops listening to opposing viewpoints, they slowly lose touch with reality. And that's exactly what happened. Projects that had been carefully planned for years were abandoned almost overnight. Reliable investments were replaced with risky ventures. Major initiatives were announced without proper preparation. Decisions affecting thousands of employees and customers were made based on instinct and pride rather than analysis and experience. And yet the consequences didn't appear immediately. In fact, that may have been the most dangerous part. The company was still strong. Revenue continued flowing from contracts signed years earlier. The reputation built over decades was still protecting the business. From the outside, everything appeared to be working, but it was an illusion. Because poor decisions rarely cause immediate damage, they work more like cracks in the foundation of a building. At first, nobody notices. The structure still looks solid. Everything appears stable, but underneath the surface the damage has already begun, and the longer it goes unnoticed, the more dangerous it becomes. That's exactly what was happening. Without realizing it, the heiress was slowly spending the most valuable asset she had inherited. Not the money, not the buildings, not the companies. Trust. The trust of employees, the trust of business partners, the trust of investors, the trust of customers. And when a company starts losing trust, everything else tends to follow. But at that moment, she remained convinced she was leading the organization toward a brighter future. She believed her critics simply didn't understand her vision. She believed the results would eventually prove everyone wrong. She believed success was just around the corner and the results were coming, but they would look nothing like she expected. Because the era of warnings was ending, and the era of consequences was about to begin. For a while, the illusion managed to survive. Every decision was still being presented as part of a bold transformation. The speeches remained optimistic. The promises of future growth echoed through boardrooms, investor meetings, and media interviews. Everything sounded convincing. Everything sounded under control. But there's one thing no company can hide forever: results. And little by little, the numbers began revealing a very different story. The first people to notice were the ones inside the organization. Veteran employees, senior executives, people who had devoted years and in some cases decades to building the company. They could see the mistakes, they could see the risks, and they tried to sound the alarm, but their warnings continued to fall on deaf ears. Some were pushed aside, others chose to leave on their own. And every time one of those experienced professionals walked out the door, they took more than a job title with them. They took knowledge. Relationships, institutional memory. Years of hard-earned experience that couldn't simply be replaced. But the heiress didn't seem to see it that way. In her mind, these departures were necessary, a sign of progress, a chance to bring in people who were more aligned with her vision. The problem was that many of those new faces lacked the skills needed to run an organization of that size. Key leadership positions began going to close friends, people who were loyal to her. But loyalty and competence are not the same thing, and that distinction would prove costly. Almost immediately, the consequences began to surface. Important decisions were being made by people who weren't prepared for the responsibility. Simple mistakes became common. Problems that once would have been solved in hours started lingering for weeks. The cracks were growing, and they were growing fast. Meanwhile, some of the company's most profitable divisions were quietly abandoned. Some because they were viewed as outdated, others because they didn't fit the modern image she wanted to create. But there was a problem. Those divisions generated reliable revenue. They helped keep the business stable. They were the financial backbone supporting much of the company's operation. Replacing them required careful planning, extensive research, a long-term strategy. But none of that happened. Instead of caution, there was risk. Instead of analysis, there was ambition. Instead of preparation, there was confidence. Millions of dollars poured into new ventures. New projects launched without proper studies. Unproven ideas received enormous funding before they had generated a single result. From the outside, it looked bold, it looked innovative, it looked visionary. But behind the scenes, it was becoming a series of expensive gambles. And yet, she remained convinced everything was under control. Whenever someone raised concerns, she insisted that every major transformation faces resistance. Whenever criticism appeared, she claimed people simply couldn't see the future she was building. Whenever results failed to materialize, she asked for more time. Just a little more time. But markets don't respond to speeches. Markets respond to numbers, and the numbers were beginning to tell a very different story. Profits started shrinking. Quarter after quarter, report after report, each financial statement became harder to explain away. At the same time, costs continued rising. Failed projects demanded additional funding. New hires increased expenses. Poorly planned investments consumed resources without producing meaningful returns. For the first time in decades, the company was becoming less efficient. And people noticed. Investors started asking difficult questions. Business partners became concerned. Market analysts revised their expectations. The trust that had taken generations to build was beginning to weaken. And trust is a strange thing. It takes years to earn, but it can disappear remarkably fast. That's exactly what was happening. Major clients started exploring alternatives. Suppliers became more cautious. Investors reduced their exposure to the company. And the more confidence declined, the more problems emerged. It became a dangerous cycle. A chain reaction, one setback creating another, one mistake amplifying the next. But despite all the warning signs, the heiress remained convinced the downturn was temporary. She believed the recovery was just around the corner. She believed the critics were overreacting. She believed she still had time to fix everything. What she didn't realize was that the situation had already crossed a dangerous line because the mistakes were no longer hidden inside the company. Now everyone could see them, and when that happens, decline tends to accelerate. The downfall that began with a series of small bad decisions was about to become a full-scale crisis, a crisis that could no longer be ignored, and the worst was still yet to come. For a while there was still hope, a belief that the company could recover, a feeling that the problems were temporary, a confidence that the family name was strong enough to survive the storm. But that hope began fading fast, because eventually the accumulated mistakes became too large to ignore. And that's exactly what happened. The first major blow came from the clients, not just any clients. These were companies that had done business with the family for years. Some had been there since the days of the founders. They had watched the organization grow. They had trusted the name, trusted the reputation, trusted the people behind it. But now they were beginning to make a painful decision: to walk away. One contract after another, long-time clients ended relationships that had taken decades to build. Some cited concerns about instability. Others simply chose not to renew their agreements. But every departure represented far more than lost revenue. It represented lost trust. And once trust is gone, winning it back becomes incredibly difficult. Unfortunately, the problems didn't stop there. Strategic partners began distancing themselves as well. Companies that once competed for the opportunity to work with the family business suddenly became cautious. Major projects were put on hold. Negotiations stalled. Potential partnerships quietly disappeared. Slowly but surely, the company was becoming isolated, and the market noticed. Investors who had viewed the organization as a symbol of stability for decades were now seeing something entirely different. Risk-questions started piling up. Concerns grew louder, and the answers coming from leadership were no longer convincing anyone. The outcome was inevitable. Capital started drying up. Investment opportunities vanished. The value of the family's companies began to decline. And what had taken generations to build started deteriorating in just a few short years. It was like watching a castle crumble brick by brick, slowly, painfully, but inevitably. Employees could feel it, clients could see it, investors recognized it. Everyone knew what was happening. Everyone except the person sitting at the top. Even with overwhelming evidence in front of her, she refused to accept reality. Every problem came with an excuse. Every failure came with someone else to blame. If sales declined, it was the economy. If investors pulled back, it was market conditions. If competitors gained ground, it was unfair competition. If projects failed, it was the team's fault. There was always an explanation, always a scapegoat, always someone responsible, anyone but her. And that may have been her biggest mistake of all, because the moment someone starts searching for people to blame, they stop searching for solutions. And without solutions, problems only get bigger. That's exactly what happened. The crisis was no longer a future possibility. It was a present. Reality, debt kept growing, revenue kept shrinking, profit margins disappeared, and desperate decisions began. Replacing strategic ones, valuable assets were sold, projects were shut down, companies within the family, portfolio were put on the market. Everything generations had built through discipline, sacrifice, and long-term thinking was being dismantled right in front of everyone's eyes. For the first time, even members of the family began to understand the true scale of the disaster. The legacy was in danger. This was no longer about a quick recovery, no longer about a difficult season. This had become a fight for survival. A desperate attempt to save whatever remained. But reality had already moved far beyond that point, because some decisions create consequences that cannot easily be undone, and some opportunities once lost never return. Yet the heiress still believed she could fix everything. She still believed the situation was under control. She still believed a turnaround was right around the corner. But the truth was something else entirely. The empire built by her grandparents, expanded by her parents, protected by generations before her, was now closer to collapse than at any point in its history, and very soon she would be forced to confront a truth she had spent years avoiding. The problem was never the market. It was never the competition. It was never the employees. The problem had been staring back at her every single day in the mirror. For a long time she believed there was still time to fix the mistakes, time to rebuild the market's trust, time to prove everyone wrong. But reality doesn't operate based on what we want to believe. It operates based on the consequences of our choices. And now those consequences had finally arrived. The debt kept growing. Revenue was no longer enough to support the massive structure that had been built over decades. Cash reserves were shrinking fast, and conversations that once seemed unthinkable were suddenly becoming very real. For the first time, the family had to consider selling off parts of the empire, not as a strategic move, not to seize an opportunity, but out of necessity. And there's a huge difference between selling to grow and selling to survive. The first sale was presented as temporary, a simple adjustment, a way to buy some breathing room, but it didn't take long to realize it wouldn't be enough. More companies had to be put on the market, more assets were sold, more pieces of the empire disappeared, and every signature on every contract represented something much bigger than a financial transaction. It represented the end of a chapter in the family's story. Businesses built by her grandparents, companies that had survived generations, projects that carried decades of sacrifice, effort, and dedication. One by one, they were slipping away. And that was the moment something finally changed inside her. For the first time in years, there were no more excuses, no more justifications, no more scapegoats. The numbers were right in front of her. The losses were right in front of her. The consequences were impossible to ignore. And for the first time, She was forced to face a truth she had spent years trying to avoid. This wasn't a temporary downturn. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't a weak economy. It wasn't a conspiracy by competitors. It was the direct result of her own decisions, one decision after another, one mistake after another, one missed opportunity after another. And the more she reflected on the past, the more painful that realization became, because now she could finally see what she had refused to see before. The advice she dismissed, the warnings she ignored, the experienced people she pushed away, the impulsive decisions she once viewed as bold leadership. Suddenly it all made sense, but there was one problem. The realization came too late. Many of the losses were irreversible, many of the opportunities were gone forever, many of the people who could have helped were no longer there. And perhaps that was the hardest part to accept. Because some mistakes can be corrected, others leave consequences that last for years. That's when she finally understood something her ancestors had always known, something that never appears in inheritance documents, something no family name can pass down. Receiving a fortune does not mean you're prepared to manage it. Inheriting a company does not mean you know how to lead it. Receiving a legacy does not mean you're capable of preserving it. Because the true value of an empire isn't measured only by the money it generates. It's measured by the discipline required to maintain it, the responsibility required to protect it, the humility to listen to people who know more than you, and the wisdom to recognize your own limitations. Her grandparents understood that. Her parents understood that. But it took her years to learn the same lesson, and by the time she finally did, much of the legacy was already gone. In that moment, she realized her greatest mistake wasn't making bad decisions. It was believing the family name would be enough to overcome them. But the market doesn't respect last names. Customers don't stay loyal because of tradition. Results don't appear because of inheritance. Those things must be earned, every single day. And now, standing in the ruins of what once seemed like an untouchable empire, she finally understood that truth. A simple truth, a painful truth. Building something great requires effort, but preserving something great requires something even rarer, the ability to be worthy of the responsibility you've been given. And she was about to discover that this would become the most important lesson of her entire life. Years passed. The headlines faded. The public debates died down. The legal battles came to an end, and life, as it always does, moved on. But some consequences don't disappear with time. They remain, quietly, buried in the memories of those who lived through them. And it was only by looking back that she finally understood something that had taken years to accept. The greatest loss was never the money. Money could be earned again. New businesses could be built. New opportunities could always appear. It wasn't the companies that had been sold. It wasn't the contracts that had been lost. It wasn't even the failed investments. Those things hurt. But they weren't what haunted her most. The real loss was something far deeper. It was knowing that her name had become attached to a story nobody wants to be remembered for. The story of someone who inherited an extraordinary legacy and failed to protect it. The story of someone who was handed the work of multiple generations and allowed much of it to disappear. That was the burden she carried, because for the first time in her life, she finally saw what her grandparents had seen. The late nights, the risks they took, the sacrifices they made, the hardships they endured. She now understood that every company that had been sold represented far more than a business asset. It represented years of dedication, years of struggle, years of dreams, entire lives invested in something that was meant to outlive them. And it was in that realization that the biggest lesson of all finally made sense. The family legacy didn't survive because of money. It survived because of the people who protected it. People who placed discipline above pride, responsibility above ego, long-term vision above short-term gratification. Those were the values that sustained the empire for decades, yet only a few years of poor decisions were enough to put everything at risk. And perhaps that's one of the most important truths in this entire story. Building something great is hard. It requires sacrifice. It requires courage. It requires persistence. But preserving something great can be even harder because it requires wisdom. It requires humility. It requires the willingness to keep learning, and it requires respect for what was built before us. In the end, she realized that the true value of an inheritance was never the assets she received. It wasn't the companies. It wasn't the properties. It wasn't the money sitting in bank accounts. The true value was the responsibility that came with it. Because wealth can be transferred, money can be transferred, assets can be transferred, but character cannot. Discipline cannot. Preparation cannot. Those are things every generation must develop for itself, and maybe that's why this story matters, because it isn't really about a wealthy family, it isn't really about business, and it isn't really about money. It's about responsibility. It's about choices. It's about consequences. And it's about how seemingly small decisions can completely change the course of a life. In the end, she learned the lesson, but she paid an enormous price for it, a price that no amount of money could prevent. And now I'd like to hear from you. Do you believe heirs should automatically take over a family business, or do you think they should prove they're qualified before being given that responsibility? Let me know in the comments below. I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts on this story. And if this video made you think, take a moment to hit the like button. It helps the channel reach more people and allows us to keep bringing you stories like this. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss future videos. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. And remember, inheriting wealth may be a privilege, but honoring a legacy is a responsibility. See you in the next video.